Cassandra Robinson was last seen on February 1st at her daughter's first birthday party.
So where did she say she was going?
She said on the way out the door, it's none of your business where I'm going, or who I'm going with, or when I'm coming back.
We don't know what happened, how it happened, when it happened.
Eggs under your eyes, you sleeping okay?
No, you've destroyed my life. Effectively and practically speaking, you have disassembled everything that I've been working for.
I care about this girl. I care about that I found her dead body in a barrel, rotting in a tray. Tell us what happened that night.
Kind of complicated situation I got going. This lady, she's 25 years old. Family said the last time they saw her was 4 months ago.
What's her name?
Cassandra Robinson. On 8th Avenue. Advise A or B.
She told us unit number.
10-4. Hey, Miss Robinson?
Yes.
Can you come out to the car for a second? Did you ever know her to live on an address off Fine Forest Road?
That's my dad. She don't stay there. She used to stay there with him.
Okay. Give me 1 second.
And she was coming from the Hidden Drive area.
Your sister has a history of having mental health issues.
Yes, sir. When our mom passed away, she went that route. You know, how certain people go certain routes, she went that route. But when she had a baby, it's like it was a whole nother her. I'm glad she had a child because it changed her. She was good, like happy, everything was good. So it's just all of a sudden she's gone. Like it's not normal.
Is she on Facebook and stuff like that?
Well, Facebook is still there. Everything's still up. She just hasn't been on it since February. She just literally February 1st, my niece's first birthday, she disappeared since then. So that's why we want to make sure she's okay.
At the time of the report, the family relayed that Cassandra was living with her boyfriend and the father of the child, and his name's Henry Steiger.
This is the guy, but my phone just looked jacked up. He goes by Henry. I know for a fact he goes by Henry.
And you said he might be living downtown?
Yes. Well, that's because my sister said she was staying, so we assumed she was staying with him, because if he moved, she usually moves with him, so.
So there was an address for Henry that we sent officers to. The officer went to that Strong Street address to try to make contact, and he no longer lived at that address.
4126.
Got it.
The Hispanic male lives there. I think we got project.
Terrible.
He's not from Florida at all. I think he's an entrepreneur, so he has like different business and he travels a lot.
Hang on 1 second. Let me look at one more thing. There's something in my gut that tells me that, hey, there's something not right about this.
We learned that Henry was on federal probation for some kind of money fraud charges.
I felt like the top person we need to go find and talk to is Henry Steiger.
Yes, hello?
Yes, this is Harry.
Yes. Yes, I just got your message to call you back.
You said that you last saw her February 1st, right?
Yeah. She says, I'm breastfeeding this child till she's 1 year old, and on her first birthday, I'm leaving. And I want you to respect my wishes not to contact me. And she left at night, and, you know, she was going to take a break.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was a break. I was just letting time go by and letting her give her space and letting her take the time she needs, and we never talked about what would happen if she never came back.
I don't know of any mother who wants to leave their child on their first birthday. To me, that is very strange.
Okay. Where was that at?
Strong Street. That's where we lived.
When did you move out?
So the birthday was February 1st, and that was the last that I saw her. And on February 8th was the official beginning date of the new lease for the house that she picked out for herself and the baby and me, and she never moved in.
It makes no sense. Why would you pick out a house but never move in? It's another red flag.
Henry Steiger was definitely considered a person of interest. We felt like there was something else going on. On February 1st, 4 months before, she made a post in reference to the baby's birthday and that, you know, the baby changed her life and she was so proud of her and they were going to have a great birthday party and just enjoy the day. After that, there were no social media posts, nothing. And then her phone last pinged on February 2nd.
We felt comfortable at the Pensacola Police Department that we need to move this case from a suspicious persons case to a missing person case and have Cassandra listed in the National Database for Missing Persons.
He answered the door and he has this baby strapped to him and he was caught off guard. I want whoever I'm going to talk to be caught off guard. Let's start at the beginning.
Sure.
Do you work?
Yeah.
Where do you work at?
I roast coffee.
Are you in business with someone or are you in business by yourself doing that?
I'm in business with someone.
What's his name?
His name is Julian Mazur. He was the right-hand man, my right-hand man.
Okay. And so, Cassandra?
Yeah.
Where did she work in, what kind of work did she do?
Well, she had the luxury of being a stay-at-home mom.
Okay. Tell us about your relationship with
My
Cassandra.
relationship with Cassandra is mostly, I'm kind of, I love her like a brother. Like I take care of her.
At some point you had a relationship.
Yes.
You have a baby, right?
Yeah. Well, we had a physical relationship off and on.
So the first year of the baby being born, she was a pretty good mom.
She felt like she wasn't a good mom. So when she left, it was not a surprise to me that she didn't come back for quite a while.
Let's talk about that. So she tells you that she's going to leave on the baby's first birthday after the party. So where did she say she was going?
She said on the way out the door, it's none of your business where I'm going, or who I'm going with, or when I'm coming back. Which is her attitude. Like, don't ask me too many questions, kind of. So I moved into here on February 8th, and I assumed she'd be back by then to help move. And the thing is, she asked me to respect her privacy and respect her wishes and to not contact her.
He did nothing to try to get in touch with her. He didn't call her family. He just, from the day of the birthday party, he moved on. Moved into another house. All of that is not right. What do you think happened to her? Where do you think she is?
You think she's dead?
I don't know.
I was very, very alarmed about the whole situation. He didn't seem concerned one bit that she was gone. And so we were all in by then. We were going to find Cassandra.
I found out Cassandra was dating Henry Steiger in 2013. According to her, she was happy, so I was happy. But as time went on, I knew that something's not right. Cassandra not telling me where exactly she was staying when I asked her, it was really odd. She would just say downtown.
She just would tell me Henry was very controlling. She wanted to leave, but she said she was kind of scared because she didn't know how he would react, so she just stayed. When my mom told me she was missing, I knew something was wrong. She wouldn't just up and leave her baby. She loved her baby too much to do something like that.
We served a search warrant on his house in Perdido Key and didn't really find anything that would lead to Cassandra. But in the garage, there was a bunch of cash, and it was determined to be like $100,000. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? You know, who's got $100,000 in their garage? There was not enough evidence at that time to arrest him for the disappearance. but he had violated his probation by having the money and not telling his probation officer. So he was taken into custody and taken to the jail.
Once Henry Steiger was arrested, the child was given over to Cassandra Robinson's family for her well-being and to take care of the child.
He was going where he belonged, but I still did not know what happened to Cassandra. He did not want to talk about that. He did not want for me to interview him. He's definitely not gonna tell me where she's at.
At that point, law enforcement needed to find out more about Henry Steiger, more about Cassandra, and more about the lifestyles that they live.
You want to just have a seat right there? They'll be right with you. Sounds good. Julian, how you doing? Chad White. Nice to meet you, Chad.
Hey.
Thank you
You're
for
coming.
coming out.
How you doing? So, you know why you're here?
No clue.
No clue. Cassandra Robinson. Do you know Cassandra?
I think I met her a couple times, but
Do you know where Cassandra is?
no idea.
My first impression of him was that he was a kid. He was very nervous. If you have nothing to hide, you're not going to be that nervous.
Never seen someone shake as much as you're shaking right now. We're not here trying to get you in trouble. Our concern is trying to find out where Cassandra might be at. I understand that.
Did you have anything to do with Cassandra's disappearance?
No.
Okay.
He was giving himself away just with the nonverbal cues. We had to find out more information. We felt like he was lying.
So, when Steiger moved from the beach, where did he move?
He moved to, well, there was like an in-between temporary place on Strong Street is where he moved. I helped him move into there.
You helped him move in? Who all was living there?
Him, and then Cassandra,
Mm-hmm.
and the baby.
Who moved to the new house?
Just him and the kid.
Where was Cassandra?
She went on a vacation. I think they had pre-orchestrated a vacation for her on the kid's birthday.
Is it, in your mind, is it normal for someone to go on vacation for 4 months? Seriously.
I mean, it depends. I think it depends on the dynamic.
Didn't leave her baby?
She was always with that baby. She was always on social media. She stayed in contact with her family. And now there's nothing. Nothing. She's not on a vacation. She's not on a vacation, as Steiger says.
Why can't
Mother's,
she go on vacation? I don't
she's,
want to think for her.
and left her baby. Oh, something happened to her. There's only one person that had a relationship with her, and that's Steiger. And so far, there's only another person that I can find out that's involved with Steiger, and that's you.
I don't want to be involved in this. I have nothing to do with this. I don't know what's going on.
Why are you shaking so much? Are you cold? Are you nervous?
He was flushed, he was sweaty, he was obviously very nervous. I felt like he was afraid. He was afraid of what Steiger had gotten him involved in. It was time now not to be so motherly.
Can you tell me about February 1st, what was going on that day?
We went to the DMV and made a deposit.
Mm-hmm.
And I dropped him off.
So did you, when you dropped him off, did you go inside?
No, go inside. I went home.
I'm going to ask you directly this question.
Go ahead.
Did you kill Cassandra?
No. 100% no.
Did Henry tell you if he killed her?
No.
Did Henry tell you exactly where she's at?
No. He just said she was on vacation.
I think you're lying. I don't think you're being completely honest with us. And I will keep digging until I find it.
I'm feeling like I need a lawyer right now.
I'm gonna get somebody, take you downstairs. Do you remember my name? Lisa? Or Chad? If you need to talk to me, call me. Okay?
At that time, we didn't have enough to hold him, and so we let him go.
Alright. Detective Hudson's gonna take you down. You swear everything you told us is the truth?
I'm not saying that.
Okay. Take care.
We felt like he knew more than what he had revealed, and I was going to find out the truth. Steiger had a friend named Shelby. He answered our questions, and he said Steiger brought his trailer and parked it at my house.
He goes on to say that it's in the middle of his honeybee farm and that we're more than welcome to go out there and check it anytime we want.
So we get a search warrant for the trailer.
Lisa and I go out to the area of town that he told us that the trailer was at. And indeed, it is in the middle of a honeybee farm.
We saw Steiger's trailer, and it was backed into the bushes.
Lisa gets out of the car. She is working her way around the trailer.
As I'm walking around, I smelled what I know to be decomposition of a human body. We opened the trailer up, and there was 2 green 55-gallon drums. The first drum, the crime scene officers opened it up, and there was nothing in there. The second drum, they had to get tools, get it open, and when they did, it was Cassandra's body in the drum. It was a very sad moment to me.
They told me that they found my sister Cassandra's body in a drum. It was terrible, like she was garbage. Why would someone do that? Like, I don't know why.
The medical examiner's office determined that the death of Cassandra was a homicide, but it was undetermined exactly how she died because of the decomposition of the body. She had been there a long time, and it was a hot summer. She was dressed in clothes to go out, to leave. We had seen pictures of her at the birthday party she had with Steiger and the baby, and she had on like a little nightgown. So I knew that between that time, she got dressed and was probably leaving with the baby.
Our next step is, okay, we need to go confront Henry with this.
Stand up on me, turn around. We'll take these off while we talk, we'll make you a little more comfortable, okay?
He looked tired, he looked worried, and he said he was willing to talk. He didn't know that we had found her body, and I wasn't going to tell him at that time. I did want him to feel comfortable. I wanted him to feel like he could freely discuss things with me.
Henry.
How you doing?
Well, not so great. I think you guys know that, though.
You got bags under your eyes. You sleeping okay?
Well, in 1 week's time, I lost my business. I lost the coffee fund that I draw from to drive that business. I guess you have my car now too. My child is separated from me, which is the worst thing. And, I can't pay the rent, so I'm losing the house. You've destroyed my life as a matter of not maybe on purpose, right?
Right.
But effectively and practically speaking, you have disassembled everything that I've been working for. I'm broken. I feel like giving up. And maybe that's your goal, and maybe that's I don't say that disrespectfully.
No, and I don't.
So when you shroud your eyes, I'm just saying that that's maybe your job and that's your toolkit. And maybe that's what you're supposed to do. And I also know that whenever there is a significant other, he's the #1 suspect. I get that, okay? And so you have to start there.
Right.
And so I understand that part.
Well, I can tell you this. I haven't used any trickery with you. I haven't lied to you. Everything I've told you, I've been upfront about. And everything you've told me, I've verified. And we totally, understand the stress that you've been going through, And it's hard. When I went in the interview, I tried to make him a little maybe at ease and act like that I really cared.
My bank account got closed when the FBI was probing around. My 12 years, everything I do is logical. I'm a very deliberate person. I also have an opportunity to be a honey sharecropper.
You said a while ago that she loved you, right?
For sure.
For sure. Did you love her?
I do, but not in the same way. More like a caretaker.
After you found out you were the father, things kind of changed a little bit,
Not
right?
really.
No, you didn't.
No, because I was playing the role.
Did she ever use that against you? Say, you with me, I'm gonna take this.
She used that against me before she knew it was mine. Before I knew it was mine, she did that all along.
Right. Did it ever make you nervous when she would say that kind of stuff? That she was gonna actually do it?
Her whole life made me nervous. Yeah, she's not a controllable person.
Right. When she said that she was gonna go on her vacation, did she say that she was gonna take the baby with her?
No, that she needed a vacation from the schedule.
I gotcha. And you were like, okay, well, you're not gonna take the baby, I'm cool.
I wasn't like that. It was like I was sympathetic to her reason for wanting to go, which was the schedule. The schedule was driving her nuts.
We've been doing a lot of investigating since we talked. We've done a lot of search warrants. At that point, I deliberately lowered my voice because if you were talking low and slow, then he's got to listen to me. It was time to move in and for him to be honest and tell me what happened. So myself and Chad, 2 days ago, brought Mr. Johnson in, Shelby. And he explained, that he had originally met you, I think, through making honey.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that you had a trailer on his property. So I went over to the trailer yesterday and took some pictures of it. I'll show it to you. Let's see if this is it. Is that it? Is that your trailer?
Mm-hmm.
The trailer slide. How long have you had it?
Few years.
Few years. So we went over and we looked at it and I detected an odor. An odor that I recognize very well for doing this job. And it's the odor of decomposition from the human body. Okay? So that immediately put my head to spinning. Okay? So we got a search warrant for it. And the keys for these locks, do you know where those keys were at? The keys were at your house. So we got the search warrant and we pulled the trailer out and we opened up the door. These containers were here. Do you recognize these containers? So something happened. I don't want my mind to be spinning and everybody else's mind to be spinning. I just need to know what happened.
and I need to know it from you. Something happened. Something happened. I don't know what happened, but I know in my heart, I don't think it was a planned and on purposely, because you love your baby, and I don't think you would do anything to harm her or harm her mother.
Of course not. Well, it is a story that I don't think anyone would believe. And that's my problem.
This is a heavy load for you to be having to deal with. I can imagine what you've been going through, the stress that you've been under.
No, not about that.
The worry.
I'm at peace with what occurred. I understand it.
What happened?
I'm not happy about it, but I understand it. I don't think I can get anyone else to understand it, so I haven't explained it to anyone. I haven't shared it with anyone. I don't know how to tell this story, or would have told it. I would have told it that night if I'd known how to tell it. I just assumed that it would look like something I was responsible for, and that there was no way out of it.
His eyes did begin to water. That's the only time he had really ever been emotional. And I thought and I hoped that he was going to let go and let the water out of the dam.
I can't help you, and I can't help to tell your story if I don't know it. Here was so that I could understand, so I didn't have to go by this evidence, that this evidence didn't speak for you, that you could speak for to this evidence.
Yeah, well, what is it that you are asking me to explain?
How Cassandra wound up in this barrel, sealed in your trailer, parked in Shelby's property. This is the way she was found. So this is what I have to go on. So this is the evidence I have to explain. This is the evidence that only I have to go on.
I understand.
I don't want to believe that you're a monster. I want to believe you're a good person and that you're going to be, you're a good dad. That's what I was believing.
Thank you.
But you're not leaving me any other choice but to believe this is a bad thing and a monster did that. And I don't want to believe that. That's why I was giving you the opportunity to tell me what happened.
Well, if you think I need the opportunity to explain to you with professional assistance.
I did realize that he's speaking about an attorney, and I didn't want to jeopardize what I already had, so I wasn't going to ask him any more questions after that.
You're welcome, Mr. Steiger. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
And these records painted a different story than what Julia Major had originally told law enforcement.
I dropped him off.
When you dropped him off, did you go inside?
Yeah, go inside.
They showed where he did not just drop off Mr. Steiger and go home, but that he came back that same night.
Why did he come back? Did he come back to help Henry commit a murder? Did he come back to help Henry dispose of the body? There was several unanswered questions that needed to be answered.
When we interviewed Julian, I just did not have the energy or the patience to try to dig it out of him. This is it. You need to tell me what you know.
My goal today is to get the details of Cassandra's death. The last time you and I talked, we could obviously tell that you were holding back, and some things you were saying, you weren't being honest. I've talked to Steiger since I've talked to you. Since we found Cassandra's body. What do you think Steiger told me about her death?
I don't know.
What do you think he told me?
Not sure I want to answer that question.
So what I would like to start with is February 1st. And you remember February 1st. Can we run through that about what time you picked Steiger up?
I want to say it was like around 2.
Okay, right.
We went to the DMV on W Street. We went to the Wells Fargo. We went to a sandwich shop, and then we went back to the house.
Do you know about what time it was then?
5:30, somewhere around there. I dropped him off and went home.
Okay. Then what did you do?
Then what did I do? I got a call from Steiger.
Do you know about what time that was?
8:30, 8:45.
All right. And so you got a call, and was it a phone call or text message?
Phone call. I ignored it. Text message. Please call. Phone call. I think I called back. Said, hey, can you please come back here real quick? So, before I got home, our last conversation in the car was that he needed a laptop that I had at that time. So that's what I went to go bring him.
All right. Then what happened?
Well, I went in the house, and he's holding the baby, and he was in a bit of a nervous mode.
Kind of hyped up?
Not kind of hyped up, he was just kind of like freaked out kind of thing. And he said that she left, that she'd taken off and left the baby, and he was freaked out because he didn't know how to raise the baby.
Did you ask him, well, where did she go?
He says she's gone, she went on vacation.
All right, and then what happened after he was nervous and saying that she left?
He said that we needed to start moving because his move was on the 8th, it was the 1st, and he said we need to get this stuff moved. We've got to get some stuff in storage, we've got to take some stuff to the trailer, we got to get this done.
And did you think that was kind of odd that he all of a sudden wanted to do this and kind of late in the night?
Yeah. Everything was packed up, just like Rubbermaid containers.
Plastic?
Yeah, like the plastic boxes.
Like, but it has a lid that goes down on it?
Right.
Right, okay. How many boxes do you think there were?
Maybe 5.
So, were they heavy?
Some of them were, a couple of them.
And he didn't say what was in them?
No. We went to the storage unit, dropped off a couple boxes at the storage unit. After we went back to the house, I ended up staying the night there. I slept on the couch. I was exhausted.
Did it appear that there had been a struggle?
No, nothing was off.
Right, okay. And the baby stayed with you guys through all that going and dropping the truck off, dropping the trailer off? Okay.
He was definitely more forthcoming than he had been, but he was not telling the full truth. I knew that. I felt that. It was time for him to see what I had. I'm going to show him my hand.
I don't think that you are being completely honest with me. I'm not satisfied with half the truth. I care about this girl. I care about this girl. I care about the fact that she is the mother of this baby. That's what I care about. I care about that I found her dead body in a barrel, rotting in a trailer. That's what I care about. It's very horrible. Horrible. It's horrible, Julian. And you were a part of it. There's your dead body in the trailers. Why don't you want to see it? Why don't you want to see it?
I've seen a dead body and I don't want to.
Well,
Tell us what happened.
tell us what happened that night.
I thought this may have been the best chance we had up to this point to potentially break him, to get him to tell us what happened.
Can you move the picture of the dead body away?
All right. It's gone. Tell us what happened.
You're gonna feel a whole lot better when you do.
It's not that I don't feel good. I didn't have anything to do with her death. I had nothing to do with it.
What happened to her?
He did it.
What did he tell you? That night when you went over there, what did he tell you?
He said that she was frantically packing, and she was grabbing all of her stuff, and she was telling him she's gonna leave, grabbing the baby. And he said he strangled her. He just said she didn't even fight back.
What were you feeling when he said that?
Complete shock.
What were you thinking?
You.
What did he say after she didn't even fight back?
He motioned.
Mm-hmm.
His hands were trembling as he checked the pulse. I just told him to stop talking.
What did he say when he checked her pulse?
Just that his hands were shaking.
He said his hands were shaking?
He said where the baby was.
I really don't want to answer that question.
You need to answer it.
Was she holding the baby?
He told me that she was holding her. That she kind of collapsed. The baby slid down her.
Did he say what he did then? Did he try to get her help? Try to revive her?
Didn't say anything.
Where do you think her body was?
Somewhere in the rest of the house. He tried to get me to help him dispose of the body. I wouldn't do it.
Did he tell you where he put her?
No. I never asked. I didn't want to know.
Did you ever think that you needed to call the police?
I was a bit afraid to call the police.
Why was that?
Just killed the mother of his child. That's the guy that drives him around.
Julian was afraid that Henry was going to hurt his family. I mean, he already knew what he was capable of, and he was scared, you know? He was a kid.
Couldn't seem to look at her. Like, I don't want to go to prison. That was my seen a body. I don't know.
Is there anything else that you have not told me that I have not asked, or I did ask that you weren't honest, that I need to know?
No, not that I know of.
In the end, Julian told the truth. Steiger was upset because she was going to leave him, and that fueled his flame and made him so angry that he killed her.
All right, I'll be right back with you.
Julian Major was charged with accessory after the fact to second-degree murder of Cassandra Robinson. Mr. Major's charges were based on his actions in helping Mr. Steiger try to get away with Miss Robinson's murder.
So we were able to get the arrest warrant for Henry for the murder. We get to tell him, you're being arrested and charged with the murder of Cassandra. It is, for me, one of the happiest moments of the case.
It was a relief to me that I could now give the family the information that, yes, he did kill her.
Swear on the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God, sir?
I do.
Okay. You're on the road. Good to see you.
Thank you. I've got the baby in front and I'm cleaning up the kitchen and the cake. And then I go back to look for her. I go to the laundry room and I push open the door and she's lying sideways on the floor against the door. And she is got a plastic bag over her face, over her whole head. Her pulse is either thready or non-existent.
You didn't do any compressions. You thought about it, but you didn't do it.
I did not do the compression.
Didn't call 911. Just let her be. Right?
That's right.
Call the police. Call the police. My baby's mother just killed herself. I walked in here, it's tragic. Please come help. That's not what he does. It's not what he does. Because that story didn't happen. That story is not in line with the evidence.
Ultimately, the jury found Mr. Steiger guilty of second-degree murder as charged.
Henry Steiger will never get out of jail, and that's exactly where he needs to be.
He was talking about how it happened so quickly. He said that she didn't even fight back.
Ultimately, Julian Major was sentenced to 15 years of probation, and as a condition of that, he had to serve 2 years in the county jail here locally.
Julian was taken advantage of by Steiger. He should have done the right thing, and the right thing would have been to, that day, call the police.
I just miss my sister. I feel like the world lost a really good person, a good mother.
This one was one that really hurt my heart. The tragedy here is the baby. The baby now doesn't have her beautiful mother, and she doesn't have a father.
My aunt is taking care of my niece. She's doing good. She looks like her. I see younger Cassandra in her.
Nearly 50 years after 19-year-old Mary Sullivan was found strangled in her Boston apartment, a microscopic biological trace preserved from that terrible night finally spoke with a voice investigators could not ignore. For decades, the name Boston Strangler had been attached to a confession, a prison cell, a dead suspect, and a question that refused to disappear. Albert DeSalvo had confessed to the murders, but he was never tried or convicted for killing Mary Sullivan. He was murdered in prison in 1973, leaving behind a story filled with contradictions, disputed confessions, and the possibility that the man who called himself the Boston Strangler might not have been responsible for every death attributed to the notorious killer. Then science reached back across half a century. In 2013, investigators announced that DNA recovered from evidence connected DeSalvo to Sullivan's murder. The result was historic. It was also unsettling. Because DNA could answer one question with extraordinary force, while leaving another question alive. Was Albert DeSalvo truly the Boston Strangler? Or had Boston spent decades trying to force a collection of separate murders into the shape of one monster? The story begins on January 4, 1964, in a Boston that was already living under the shadow of fear. The city had spent years hearing about women found dead in apartments, bedrooms, and homes. The victims were different ages. Their circumstances were different. Yet a disturbing pattern had emerged. Women were being strangled. Some had been sexually assaulted. Doors were sometimes locked. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. The killer seemed capable of entering private spaces and leaving almost nothing behind. Newspapers filled their pages with warnings. Families became nervous. Women changed routines. The phrase Boston Strangler became more than a nickname. It became a threat that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. Mary Sullivan was 19. She had grown up in Cape Cod and had graduated from Barnstable High School in 1962. People who knew her remembered a young woman with energy, warmth, and an ordinary future ahead of her. She was working at Filling's department store in Boston and sharing an apartment at 44A Charles Street. There was nothing about January 4th that suggested history was about to change. There was no dramatic warning, no alarm, no desperate phone call. Just an ordinary city moving through another winter day. That evening, 2 of Sullivan's roommates returned from work. They saw Mary lying in bed and initially believed she was asleep. They prepared dinner. They tried to wake her. Then something changed. The room was no longer ordinary. The young woman in the bed was dead. A motorcycle officer responding to the screams found the horrifying scene. A nylon stocking and 2 scarves were around Mary's neck. The evidence indicated strangulation. The room became a crime scene. Investigators entered. Questions began immediately. Who had been there? How had the killer entered? Why Mary? Had she known him? Had she invited him inside? Had he been watching her? Was this another killing committed by the same predator who had terrified Boston? The investigators did not yet have the answer, but they had something far more valuable than they realized: physical evidence. In 1964, forensic science could not extract the kind of genetic information investigators would later recover from preserved biological material. DNA profiling, as modern detectives know it, did not exist. A stain was simply a stain. A biological trace might be collected, cataloged, and stored, but its full meaning could remain invisible for decades. That would become the strange legacy of Mary Sullivan's murder. Her death was eventually regarded as the final killing attributed to the Boston Strangler. The number commonly associated with the case grew to 13 victims, although the question of whether one man was responsible for all of them remained deeply controversial. Investigators had theories. Suspects appeared. Confessions emerged. But certainty never arrived. And at the center of the mystery stood Albert DeSalvo. He was not convicted of murdering Mary Sullivan. In fact, his criminal conviction was for unrelated sexual assaults known as the Green Man crimes. Yet while in prison, DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler. His confession contained details about several killings that appeared difficult to know unless he had direct knowledge of the crimes. But the confession was also surrounded by controversy. DeSalvo's attorney had negotiated circumstances under which the confession could not be used against him in a murder prosecution. DeSalvo was never brought to trial for Sullivan's death. Then, in 1973, he was stabbed to death inside prison. The man who had claimed responsibility was suddenly gone. The case did not die with him. Instead, it became one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. For investigators, the problem was brutal. They had a dead suspect, no courtroom verdict connecting him to Mary Sullivan's murder, and decades of doubt. For Mary's family, the problem was even more personal. A name was not the same as justice. A confession was not the same as proof. And a notorious label attached to a murder did not explain who had actually entered Mary's room and taken her life. The years passed. Boston changed. Buildings changed. People who remembered the murders grew old. Some witnesses died. Some records became fragile. But evidence remained. And inside that evidence was something no investigator in 1964 could have imagined: a biological signature waiting for technology to catch up. For nearly 50 years, Mary Sullivan's killer lived in the space between suspicion and proof. Then one day that space began to collapse. The investigation was no longer simply about what Albert DeSalvo had said. It was about what his DNA could prove. And that distinction would change the Boston Strangler story forever. The first investigators had searched rooms, questioned suspects, examined bodies, reconstructed timelines, and listened to confessions. The new investigators had something different. they had science. And science does not care what a newspaper headline says. It does not care what a suspect claims. It does not care what a city wants to believe. A genetic match either supports a connection or it does not. After nearly half a century, the evidence from Mary Sullivan's final night was ready to answer one of the questions that had haunted Boston since 1964. Was Albert DeSalvo really there? The answer was waiting in a trace so small that it could have been overlooked forever. But it had not been destroyed. It had been preserved. And the clock was finally beginning to run backward. For years, investigators had searched for a way to compare the biological evidence associated with Mary Sullivan's murder to DeSalvo himself. But DeSalvo had been dead since 1973. His body was buried. There was no living suspect standing in an interrogation room, no fresh blood sample, no new confession. The conventional route to a direct comparison appeared closed. Then investigators found another route. A discarded water bottle. The object came from a relative of DeSalvo. Investigators secretly obtained the sample after following the relative and recovering the discarded bottle. The resulting DNA profile provided enough information to establish a connection between the family and the biological material recovered from the Sullivan crime scene. That preliminary result was significant enough for authorities to seek a direct sample from DeSalvo's remains. The decision was extraordinary. Exhumation is not something investigators undertake casually, especially in a case nearly 50 years old. But this was not merely an old homicide. It was the Boston Strangler case. It was a case that had shaped the identity of an entire city. It had produced one of the most infamous criminal legends in American history. And now modern forensic science had created a path back to the dead man at the center of it. In July 2013, Albert DeSalvo's body was exhumed. The image was almost surreal. A man who had been dead for 4 decades was being brought back into the investigation. Not alive. Not to answer questions. Not to face a jury. But to provide something he could never have imagined when he died. His DNA. The sample was sent for testing. Then investigators waited. For Mary Sullivan's family, there was no spectacle in the science. There was only the possibility that the uncertainty surrounding her death might finally narrow. For investigators, the stakes were enormous. If the DNA did not match, the DeSalvo theory would suffer another devastating blow. If it did match, investigators would have the strongest scientific connection ever established between DeSalvo and Sullivan's murder. But even then, another problem remained. A DNA match could establish that DeSalvo's biological material was associated with the crime. It could not, by itself, answer every question about the Boston Strangler murders. That distinction would become critical. The laboratory results came back. They matched. The biological evidence recovered from Mary Sullivan's apartment was consistent with Albert DeSalvo. The decades-old suspicion had acquired a forensic foundation. The man who had confessed was now genetically connected to the crime. For investigators, the announcement was historic. For the public, it was explosive. The Boston Strangler mystery, which had seemed frozen in the 1960s, suddenly had a scientific answer. But the answer was more precise than the headlines. It established DeSalvo's connection to Mary Sullivan. It did not automatically establish that he had killed every woman attributed to the Boston Strangler. That distinction mattered because the original case had always contained cracks. The murders were not identical. The victims were not identical. The circumstances differed. And investigators had long struggled with the question of whether one offender could truly account for all the killings. Even DeSalvo's confession had not erased every doubt. Some details seemed compelling. Others raised questions. Could DeSalvo have learned information from investigators? Could he have heard details from other people? Was he seeking notoriety? Was he trying to construct a legend around himself? Or was the simplest explanation the correct one, that he really was the killer, and that the contradictions came from the limitations of memory, investigation, and a criminal confession made under unusual circumstances. The DNA result did not settle all of those questions, but it changed one part of the story permanently. Mary Sullivan was no longer connected to DeSalvo solely by his words. There was physical evidence. There was biology. There was a genetic bridge spanning nearly 50 years. And that bridge led directly back to January 4, 1964. The room at Charles Street. The young woman in the bed. The scarves. The stocking. The silence after the screams. For investigators, the evidence had survived longer than almost everyone involved. That was the strange power of the cold case. Time had destroyed memories. It had changed neighborhoods. It had taken witnesses. It had taken the suspect. But it had not taken everything. One microscopic trace remained. And eventually science learned how to read it. The Boston Strangler investigation had entered a new era. But instead of ending the mystery, the DNA result created a more complicated question. If DeSalvo killed Mary Sullivan, what about the other women? That question had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting beneath the headlines. Because the Boston Strangler was not one crime. It was a collection of deaths. A collection of families. A collection of crime scenes. And perhaps, according to some investigators and researchers, a collection of different killers. The phrase Boston Strangler had created the image of one predator moving through the city. But criminal cases are rarely as clean as their legends. The public wants a single face, a single name, a single explanation. Reality is usually messy. In the early 1960s, Boston was frightened by a series of murders involving women across the metropolitan area. Some victims were elderly, others were young. Some appeared to have been sexually assaulted. Several were strangled with objects found nearby or brought into the scene. There were different methods, different locations, different circumstances. Yet newspapers and investigators increasingly connected them. The city began looking for one monster. Then came DeSalvo. His confession seemed to provide the missing piece. But a confession is not automatically a conviction. DeSalvo was never prosecuted for Mary Sullivan's murder. He was never convicted of the Boston Strangler killings. His confession existed in a strange legal and investigative space, powerful enough to shape public understanding but insufficient to produce a murder verdict. When he died in prison, the possibility of a trial disappeared. The mystery became permanent. That is why the 2013 DNA discovery carried such weight. It did something the confession never could. It connected biological evidence from the Sullivan crime scene to DeSalvo. The dead man could no longer tell investigators whether he was lying. The DNA did not lie in the same way. But even DNA has limits. It can place a person in relation to biological evidence. It cannot automatically reconstruct an entire crime. It cannot tell investigators what happened in every minute of an attack. It cannot explain motive. It cannot reveal thoughts. And it cannot prove that one suspect committed crimes for which there is no matching biological evidence. That is why the Sullivan case remains so fascinating. The DNA answer was powerful. It was also narrow. Albert DeSalvo was connected to Mary Sullivan. That was the breakthrough. But the larger Boston Strangler mystery remained more difficult. For years, some relatives and researchers had suspected that DeSalvo might not have been responsible for all of the murders attributed to him. Some investigators had expressed similar doubts. Even in the aftermath of the DNA confirmation, authorities were cautious about claiming that every Strangler killing had been solved. That caution matters. Because the word solved can mean two different things. One meaning is that investigators know who killed a particular victim. The other is that they understand the entire criminal series. Mary Sullivan's murder moved dramatically toward the first category. The second remained elusive. And that is where the story becomes darker. Imagine Boston in 1964. A woman closes her apartment door. A light burns in a window. Cars pass on Charles Street. People walk home. Inside one apartment, Mary Sullivan is alive. Then, sometime during the night, she is not. Her killer leaves. The city continues moving. Morning comes. The discovery follows. The police arrive. The headlines begin. And somewhere in the investigation, evidence is collected that will remain silent for decades. Nobody knows what that evidence will eventually reveal. Nobody knows that modern genetics will transform homicide investigations. Nobody knows that investigators decades later will exhume a dead man and compare his genetic material to a trace preserved from the crime. Nobody knows that a mystery apparently buried with the 1960s will return to the front pages. At the time, detectives had only the tools available to them. They worked with fingerprints, witnesses, confessions, physical objects, statements, timelines. They did not have the forensic power investigators would later possess. That limitation is essential when judging old cases. A case that could not be solved in 1964 might be solvable in 2013. The evidence did not necessarily become stronger. The science became stronger. That difference is what turned Mary Sullivan's murder from a historic mystery into a forensic breakthrough. But there was another problem. The passage of time. Every year that passed made the investigation more fragile. People died. Memories changed. Buildings were renovated. Objects disappeared. Documents deteriorated. And yet the evidence connected to Mary remained. The preservation of that material became one of the most important decisions in the entire case. Investigators could not know in 1964 that forensic science would one day be capable of extracting a usable genetic profile from evidence collected decades earlier. They only knew that the evidence mattered. So it survived. That survival became the bridge between two worlds. The world of the original detectives and the world of modern DNA analysis. When the genetic connection to DeSalvo was announced, it was not simply a technological triumph. It was a reminder that a cold case is never entirely frozen as long as evidence survives. A detective can retire. A suspect can die. A witness can disappear. But evidence can wait. Mary Sullivan's evidence waited almost 50 years. And when it finally spoke, it did not tell the entire story. It told one crucial part. Albert DeSalvo was connected to the young woman, whose murder had become synonymous with the end of the Boston Strangler era. That alone was enough to change history. But the story of Mary Sullivan did not begin with Albert DeSalvo. It began with Mary. That is easy to forget. Criminal legends have a dangerous habit of swallowing their victims. The killer gets the nickname. The killer gets the books. The killer gets the movies. The killer becomes a character. The victim becomes a number. Mary Sullivan was 19 years old. She had friends. She had family. She had plans. She had a workplace. She had a home. She was not born to become a chapter in a criminal legend. She was simply living her life. That January night, everything changed. Her death devastated people who knew her. Then the public absorbed the case into a larger narrative. Mary became the final victim. The final name on a list. The young woman at 44A Charles Street. The victim whose murder helped cement the legend of the Boston Strangler. But the forensic evidence reminds us that she was also an individual homicide victim. Her killer left something behind. That biological evidence became more than laboratory material. It became a voice from the room. A voice saying that someone connected to Albert DeSalvo had been there. Then the direct comparison to DeSalvo's remains strengthened that connection. For a case built on uncertainty, The result was extraordinary. But justice does not always arrive in a perfect form. There was no courtroom confrontation. No jury. No cross-examination. No sentence for Mary's murder. The man connected to the evidence had already been dead for 40 years. The confirmation could not bring him back. Could not give Mary another life. It could not return the years stolen from her family. Could only change the historical record. And perhaps in a cold case that is sometimes what science can do. It can take a question that has haunted generations and replace uncertainty with evidence. Not all uncertainty. Not every question. But one important truth. For Mary Sullivan, that truth mattered. The Boston Strangler case had always been a story about fear. But after the DNA breakthrough, it became something else. It became a story about persistence. Investigators had refused to discard the old evidence. Laboratory scientists had continued to develop new techniques. Cold case detectives had reopened questions that earlier generations could not answer. And eventually the past collided with the future. The collision produced a DNA match. It also produced an uncomfortable realization. The truth had been sitting in evidence storage for decades. Not hidden in a secret confession. Not buried in a lost diary. Not waiting in the memory of an aging witness. It was there all along. The problem was that nobody yet knew how to read it. That is what makes the case so haunting. The evidence had outlived the killer. It had outlived the detectives. It had outlived the original investigation. It had outlived the headlines. And finally, it outlived the mystery itself, at least in part. Yet Boston was left with a question that DNA could not completely erase. Was Albert DeSalvo the Boston Strangler? For Mary Sullivan, the evidence gave the strongest answer investigators had ever possessed. For the other victims, the answer was more complicated. And for the city, the name remained a shadow. The Boston Strangler had become part of Boston's history, but history is not the same thing as certainty. The city had spent decades believing it knew the face of its monster. Then forensic science confirmed one connection. And simultaneously reminded everyone how much remained unknown. That is the strange paradox of cold cases. Sometimes solving one piece of a mystery reveals the size of everything that is still missing. In Mary Sullivan's case, the missing years could never be recovered. The January night of 1964 could never be replayed. The killer could never be interrogated. No detective could stand in that apartment again and ask what happened in real time. But the evidence could still speak. And when it did, it changed the story. For nearly 50 years, Mary Sullivan's murder existed inside a cloud of confession, suspicion, rumor, and legend. Then DNA cut through the fog. Not with a dramatic confession. Not with a witness pointing across a courtroom. Not with a suspect suddenly appearing at a police station. With molecules. With a genetic signature. With science. The technology that did not exist when Mary died became the technology that finally connected her to the man who had spent decades being called the Boston Strangler. That is why the case remains one of the most haunting cold cases in American history. Because the answer did not arrive when investigators expected it. It arrived when almost everyone connected to the original investigation was gone. The suspect was gone. Many witnesses were gone. The city had changed. But Mary's evidence remained. And somewhere inside that evidence was the truth. For decades, investigators had asked who killed Mary Sullivan. In the end, DNA gave them a name. Albert DeSalvo. But history demands another question. What else did he do? And what did he not do? That question cannot be answered simply by repeating the confession. It cannot be answered by repeating the nickname. It cannot be answered by assuming that every murder attributed to the Boston Strangler belonged to the same hand. The DNA evidence established a powerful connection to Mary Sullivan. It did not magically rewrite every crime scene from the 1960s. It did not erase the doubts that had existed since the beginning. And perhaps that is why the Boston Strangler remains so compelling. Because even after the science, there is still darkness around the edges. There are murders. There are victims. There are confessions. There are contradictions. There is a dead suspect. There is evidence. And there is time. Nearly half a century passed before the genetic clue could be interpreted. By then, the case had become something larger than a homicide investigation. It had become a warning. Never assume old evidence is worthless. Never assume a case is truly dead. Never assume a mystery will remain unsolved simply because the first generation of investigators could not solve it. Science changes. Technology changes. Databases grow. Forensic methods evolve. And sometimes the smallest fragment left behind at a crime scene can survive long enough to outlive an entire investigation. Mary Sullivan's case is proof. On January 4, 1964, a 19-year-old woman entered the pages of history through violence. For decades, her death was surrounded by one of America's most infamous criminal legends. Then, almost 50 years later, the evidence began to speak. It spoke quietly. It did not shout. It did not offer a motive. It did not reconstruct the entire night. It simply connected a biological trace to a man who had been dead for decades. That was enough to change what investigators knew. And perhaps the most chilling part is this. The evidence had been there all along. Waiting. Silent. Patient. While Boston moved forward. While buildings changed. While newspapers faded. While memories disappeared. While Albert DeSalvo became a name from another era. The evidence remained. And when science finally caught up with it, the past returned. Not as a ghost. Not as a rumor. As DNA. As a connection. As a piece of truth preserved in the darkness. Mary Sullivan could never speak for herself again. But the evidence left behind from the night she died eventually did. And after nearly 50 years, it said the name that generations of investigators had spent decades trying to prove. Albert DeSalvo. Yet the final irony of the Boston Strangler case is that even a scientific breakthrough could not make every question disappear. One mystery moved closer to resolution. Another remained. If DeSalvo was responsible for Mary Sullivan's murder, was he responsible for all the women whose deaths became part of the Boston Strangler legend? The evidence did not provide a simple answer. And perhaps it never will. Because some cold cases do not end with a perfect final scene. There is no courtroom. No confession under fluorescent lights. No detective placing handcuffs on a living suspect. Sometimes the closest thing to an ending is a laboratory report produced decades after the crime. Sometimes justice arrives after the suspect is already dead. Sometimes the victim's name survives longer than the killer's certainty. And sometimes a single strand of biological evidence can cross half a century and reopen a story everyone thought had already been written. That is what happened to Mary Sullivan. A 19-year-old woman. A Boston apartment. A winter night. A terrible discovery. A city gripped by fear. A suspect who confessed. A suspect who died. A case that refused to disappear. And finally DNA. Nearly 50 years later, the science had caught up with the crime. But the shadows remained. Because the Boston Strangler was never only a name. It was a question. And even after the DNA match, that question still echoes through Boston. How many women did Albert DeSalvo actually kill? How many murders were committed by someone else? How much of the confession was truth? How much was performance? And how many answers disappeared forever when the people who knew them died? Those questions may never be completely resolved. But Mary Sullivan's story no longer rests only on a confession. It rests on evidence. Evidence that survived. Evidence that waited. Evidence that finally spoke. And somewhere beneath the noise of the headlines, beneath the mythology of the Boston Strangler, beneath decades of speculation, there remains one simple fact. Mary Sullivan was 19 years old. She should have had decades ahead of her. Instead, she became the victim whose case waited almost half a century for science to say what investigators could not prove in 1964. The city moved on. The decades passed. The killer died. The mystery endured. But the evidence remained. And that is why, even after all these years, the story of Mary Sullivan still refuses to disappear. Because sometimes the past does not stay buried. Sometimes it waits in silence. Sometimes it survives inside a sealed piece of evidence. And sometimes nearly 50 years later it finally speaks. When it does, the voice is quiet, cold, scientific, unforgiving. DNA does not remember the headlines. It does not remember the fear. It does not remember the legend. It remembers only what was left behind. And what was left behind in Mary Sullivan's case was enough to bring Albert DeSalvo back into the story one final time. Not as a confession. Not as a rumor. Not merely as the man Boston believed might be the Boston Strangler. But as a man whose genetic material was connected to evidence from the murder of a 19-year-old woman, whose death had haunted the city for nearly half a century. The mystery had waited 50 years for that answer. And when the answer came, it did not arrive with a scream. It arrived in a laboratory. It arrived on paper. It arrived through science. And it left behind the most haunting question of all. If one forgotten trace could survive nearly 50 years and reveal a hidden truth, how many other cold cases are still waiting for their evidence to speak? The laboratory result had changed the case, but it had not changed the past. Mary Sullivan was still dead. Albert DeSalvo was still dead. The apartment at Charles Street was still a place where, nearly half a century earlier, an ordinary winter night had ended in murder. What changed was the evidence. For the first time, investigators possessed a forensic connection that did not depend entirely on DeSalvo's controversial confession. The biological material associated with Mary Sullivan's murder pointed toward the man who had spent decades carrying the title of Boston Strangler. But the moment that connection became public, another question rose immediately from the darkness. If DeSalvo was connected to Mary Sullivan, what did that mean for the other women whose deaths had been placed under the same name? That question had haunted investigators from the beginning. The Boston Strangler was never a conventional single crime. It was a series of murders occurring across a period of years, involving women of different ages and circumstances. The theory of one killer gave the cases a terrifying coherence. One predator, one pattern, one city under siege. But criminal investigations are rarely so neat. Similarities can suggest a connection without proving one. Common method can be copied. A confession can contain truth and exaggeration. A suspect can know details for reasons that investigators do not immediately understand. And a frightened public can transform separate crimes into one terrifying legend. That was the environment in which Albert DeSalvo emerged. He was not discovered standing over Mary Sullivan's body. He was not arrested at the Charles Street apartment. He was not prosecuted for her murder. His conviction came from other crimes. His claim to be the Boston Strangler developed later, and his confession became one of the most controversial elements of the entire investigation. Some details appeared strikingly specific. Others produced doubts. His attorneys understood that a confession without a prosecutable case could still have enormous consequences. DeSalvo became famous. The victims became associated with him. And the public began to hear one name again and again. Albert DeSalvo. Boston Strangler. The two names became almost inseparable. But a nickname is not evidence. That distinction became even more important after DeSalvo's death. In November 1973, He was stabbed to death inside Walpole State Prison. He had been serving a life sentence for unrelated crimes. The man who had claimed responsibility for the Boston killings could no longer be questioned. No prosecutor could place him before a jury. No defense attorney could challenge his statements. No detective could return to the interrogation room and ask him why he had confessed, which details were true, and which details had been invented. The case had lost its most important living witness. Then time did what time always does. It moved forward. The 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. The city changed. New generations grew up without direct memories of the terror. The Boston Strangler became part of American criminal folklore. Books were written. Television programs revisited the murders. The name remained familiar, even as the people who had lived through the original investigation disappeared. And beneath that mythology, the physical evidence waited. That evidence mattered because forensic science was changing at a speed nobody in 1964 could have predicted. DNA profiling would eventually transform homicide investigations. Biological traces that once had limited value could become powerful identifiers. A sample collected from a crime scene could potentially be compared to a suspect decades later. But there was a problem. The suspect was dead. Investigators needed a reference sample. They could not simply ask DeSalvo for blood. They could not collect saliva from an interrogation room. They could not obtain a cheek swab from a living man. So investigators looked for another path. Family. A relative could provide a genetic bridge. It would not be the same as testing DeSalvo directly, but familial DNA could establish whether biological material was consistent with his family line. Investigators secretly obtained a discarded water bottle from one of DeSalvo's relatives and used the DNA recovered from it as an investigative comparison. The result provided enough information to pursue a direct test from DeSalvo's remains. The operation was almost invisible to the public. There was no dramatic arrest. No squad cars. No flashing lights. No suspect being marched into a police station. The suspect had been dead for decades. Instead, detectives were following something much smaller. A genetic trail. A discarded object. A laboratory profile. Possibility. Then came the decision to exhume DeSalvo. Imagine the symbolism. A man whose name had dominated the case since the 1960s was being brought back into the investigation not because he could speak, but because his body could provide evidence. The grave was opened. The remains were recovered. A sample was obtained. The investigation had reached across 40 years and found a way to put the suspect and the crime scene into the same forensic conversation. The result was the moment investigators had been waiting for. The DNA associated with the Sullivan crime scene was consistent with DeSalvo. The confession, once surrounded by uncertainty, now had a scientific connection behind it. But the announcement did not produce the clean ending that the public expected. It produced something more complicated. Because Mary Sullivan was one victim. The Boston Strangler was a larger theory. And DNA had answered only the question it was capable of answering. Was DeSalvo connected to the biological evidence from Mary Sullivan's murder? The answer was yes. But was he responsible for every murder attributed to the Boston Strangler? That remained a separate question. This distinction is crucial. When a case becomes famous, the public often remembers the conclusion more clearly than the evidence. DNA solved the Boston Strangler sounds definitive. But forensic science is not a magic key capable of unlocking every door at once. It can identify relationships between evidence and individuals. It can strengthen or weaken a theory. It can establish connections that were previously based on suspicion. It cannot automatically rewrite evidence that does not exist. It cannot create DNA from another crime scene. It cannot prove that two unrelated murders were committed by the same person merely because one suspect was linked to one victim. And in the Boston Strangler investigation, those limitations mattered. The original series had always contained uncertainty. Some victims had different profiles. Some crime scenes raised different questions. The methods were not perfectly uniform. The locations were scattered. The timelines were not simple. The victims were not all alike. Yet fear had encouraged the city to search for a single explanation. That explanation became the Boston Strangler. And DeSalvo became the face of it. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility was that Boston had spent decades trying to solve several different mysteries with one answer. That possibility refused to disappear. The DNA result did not destroy the DeSalvo theory. It strengthened it in relation to Mary Sullivan. At the same time, it exposed the difference between solving a murder and solving a series. Mary's murder could be approached through evidence. The larger series required something more. It required examining every crime independently. Every victim. Every timeline. Every piece of physical evidence. Every confession. Every witness. Every contradiction. That is a much harder task. And perhaps no one understood that better than the investigators who inherited the case decades later. They were not working with a fresh crime scene. They were working with history. The original detectives had made decisions without modern DNA technology. They had collected evidence according to the standards of their era. They had interviewed witnesses who had lived through shock and fear. They had dealt with the city demanding answers. Today, forensic investigators understand something that earlier generations could not. Evidence can become more valuable with time if technology improves. A biological sample that seemed insignificant in 1964 might become critical decades later. That principle has transformed cold case investigations across the United States. Massachusetts itself developed increasingly sophisticated systems for the collection, storage, testing, and management of DNA evidence. State regulations governing forensic DNA were already in place by 2013, reflecting how dramatically the science and its infrastructure had evolved. But the science is only useful if the evidence survives. That is where Mary Sullivan's case becomes extraordinary. The investigation had survived long enough for technology to catch up. The evidence had not disappeared. The chain between crime scene and laboratory had remained intact enough to allow a comparison. And that meant the past could still be interrogated. Not through memory. Through biology. For Mary's family, however, the scientific discovery could never be just a forensic headline. The years did not disappear when the DNA result was announced. Neither did the grief. Mary was still 19. Her life had still been taken in a matter of minutes. Her family had still endured decades of uncertainty. And the man connected to the evidence was still beyond the reach of a courtroom. There would be no sentencing hearing for Mary. No jury verdict. No judge announcing a punishment. The breakthrough could establish a historical truth, but it could not restore the justice system's missing moment. That is one of the cruelest realities of cold cases. Sometimes investigators solve a murder after the person responsible has already died. The truth arrives. But the legal ending never does. The discovery also raised another uncomfortable issue. What exactly had DeSalvo meant when he confessed? Was his confession entirely truthful? Was he claiming responsibility for murders he actually committed? Was he exaggerating? Was he seeking attention? Did he know details because he had committed the crimes, or because information had traveled through investigators, journalists, prisoners, or other sources? These questions became more important after the DNA result. Because now there was a confirmed biological connection to one victim. That made the confession harder to dismiss entirely. But it did not make every statement automatically true. A person can tell the truth about one crime and lie about another. A person can confess accurately to one murder and exaggerate a series. A person can possess information that seems impossible without having committed every crime connected to it. The DNA did not erase those possibilities. It narrowed them. That was its power. It did not provide mythology. It provided evidence. And evidence is often less satisfying than a legend because evidence has boundaries. The legend says one man terrorized Boston. The evidence says something more precise. Albert DeSalvo was connected by DNA to evidence from Mary Sullivan's murder. Everything beyond that must be examined separately. That distinction became the dividing line between history and folklore. The Boston Strangler story had been built around the idea of a single predator. The Mary Sullivan evidence gave investigators a concrete connection. But the larger mystery remained. And the unanswered questions were not abstract. They belonged to real women. Women whose names had once filled Boston newspapers. Women whose families had waited for answers. Women whose murders had been folded into the same terrifying narrative. If DeSalvo did not kill all of them, then somewhere in the shadows of the 1960s there may have been another killer. Or several. That possibility is far more disturbing than the simple story of one monster. Because one monster can be named. One monster can be studied. One monster can be placed inside a timeline. But if the Boston Strangler label concealed multiple offenders, then the case becomes a maze. Different killers. Different motives. Different opportunities. Different evidence. Different truths. And some of those truths may have died with the people who knew them. That is why the DNA breakthrough should not be remembered as the moment every Boston Strangler murder was solved. It was the moment one of the most important questions received a powerful forensic answer. Mary Sullivan's murder was no longer supported only by an old confession and decades of suspicion. There was biological evidence. There was a genetic connection. There was a scientific link between the victim's final hours and the man whose name had dominated the case. Nearly 50 years had passed. But the evidence had survived. And now investigators faced a new challenge. They had to separate what they knew from what they believed. They had to distinguish one proven connection from a larger theory. They had to look beyond the legend. Because the truth of a cold case does not become clearer simply because a famous name has been attached to it. Sometimes the opposite happens. The famous name becomes the obstacle. And in Boston the name was DeSalvo. The face of the strangler. The confessed killer. The dead man whose DNA had finally returned to the crime scene. But as investigators looked closer, the case did not become smaller. It became larger. The DNA had opened the door. Behind that door were decades of unanswered questions. And beyond those questions were the other victims. Their stories were still waiting. Their evidence was still waiting. Their families were still waiting. And somewhere in the darkness of the old investigation was the possibility that the Boston Strangler was never as simple as the city had been told. The first breakthrough had arrived. But the deeper mystery had just begun. The deeper mystery began with a question that had never truly gone away. If Albert DeSalvo had killed Mary Sullivan, what did that tell investigators about the women whose deaths had been linked to him but never scientifically connected to him? The answer was uncomfortable. It told them that one part of the Boston Strangler story had become stronger, while the larger story remained uncertain. The DNA evidence had transformed suspicion into a powerful forensic connection in Sullivan's case. But it did not reach backward through every crime scene. It did not place DeSalvo at every apartment. It did not explain every murder. And it did not erase the doubts that had existed since the beginning. That distinction matters because the Boston Strangler was not born from a single crime. The legend grew from fear. One murder became another, then another. Newspapers began connecting the cases. Investigators looked for patterns. The public wanted a name. A city under pressure wanted an explanation. Eventually the name appeared. The Boston Strangler. The label was terrifying because it suggested one person was moving through the city, entering the private spaces where people should have felt safest, killing women, and disappearing before anyone could stop him. But beneath that terrifying simplicity was a complicated collection of cases. The victims were not identical. Their ages varied. Their lives were different. Their apartments were different. The circumstances surrounding their deaths were different. And yet the cases became linked. That connection would shape everything that followed. Once investigators believed one killer might be responsible, every new murder was viewed through the same lens. Similarities became more significant. Differences could be dismissed as variations in behavior. The investigation became a search for a single offender. Then DeSalvo entered the picture. He was a man who already had a criminal history. He was already known to police. He already had a reputation for sexual violence. And then came the confession. Suddenly, the terrifying theory had a human face. For the public, that was enough. For investigators, it was more complicated. DeSalvo described killings he claimed to have committed. Some details appeared striking. His statements attracted attention. But there was a fundamental problem. He was never tried for those murders. The justice system never produced a verdict declaring him guilty of killing Mary Sullivan. That meant that, for decades, his role remained trapped between confession and proof. Then came the DNA. The 2013 breakthrough changed the evidentiary landscape. Investigators announced that DNA recovered from the Sullivan crime scene matched DeSalvo's genetic profile. The connection was powerful enough to dramatically strengthen the conclusion that DeSalvo had been involved in Sullivan's death. But the breakthrough also exposed the limitations of the old narrative. If science could confirm one murder, then every other murder needed to be considered on its own evidence. That is where the case became much darker. Because the women were not simply names on a list. Each had entered the story before anyone knew the name Boston Strangler. Each had been living a life. Each had expected another morning. Each had families. Each had people who knew their voices, their habits, their plans. Then the murders turned them into victims of a historical mystery. The name of the killer became famous. The names of the women became less familiar. Mary Sullivan, however, remained at the center because her murder carried a unique historical weight. She was young. She was 19. She was living in Boston. And her death occurred at the point when the city's fear had become almost unbearable. Her murder was not simply another homicide. It became the final killing traditionally attributed to the Boston Strangler. That designation would follow her for decades. But the DNA evidence changed how investigators could discuss her death. It gave them something that the original investigation lacked. A forensic bridge. The bridge ran from the crime scene to DeSalvo. And once that bridge existed, investigators could no longer treat his confession as the only connection. But they also could not use it to automatically solve every other murder. This is where cold case investigations become difficult. There is enormous pressure to find a complete answer. The public wants closure. Families want justice. News organizations want a clear conclusion. But investigators have to work with what the evidence actually establishes. Sometimes the evidence says yes. Sometimes it says no. And sometimes it says only maybe. The Sullivan case moved much closer to yes. The larger Boston Strangler series remained somewhere between certainty and doubt. That uncertainty had existed long before the DNA breakthrough. In fact, it was one of the reasons the case remained so controversial. The murders had different characteristics. Some involved women who were elderly. Others involved younger women. The locations varied. The apparent circumstances varied. Some women appeared to have been sexually assaulted. Others did not fit the pattern as neatly. Investigators could see similarities. They could also see contradictions. And contradictions are dangerous in a case built around one offender. Because if the same killer committed every murder, investigators have to explain the differences. If different killers committed the murders, investigators have to explain the similarities. Either way, there is a puzzle. The Boston Strangler investigation lived inside that puzzle for decades. Then DeSalvo's confession seemed to offer a solution. But confessions can be complicated. A confession is a statement. DNA is physical evidence. The two can reinforce each other. But they are not interchangeable. DeSalvo could tell investigators what he claimed to have done. DNA could establish whether his biological material was associated with evidence. The difference became critical. For Mary Sullivan, the two pieces pointed in the same direction. That convergence was powerful. But investigators still had to resist the temptation to let one answer swallow every unanswered question. The history of criminal investigation is filled with cases where investigators became attached to a theory. Once a theory takes hold, evidence can be interpreted through it. A suspicious person becomes more suspicious. An ambiguous detail becomes significant. A contradiction becomes an exception. And before long, the investigation begins moving toward the conclusion everyone expects. The Boston Strangler case was especially vulnerable to that phenomenon because the public had already created the narrative. There was a killer. There was a pattern. There was a name. There had to be one man. But perhaps there did not. That possibility had been raised repeatedly over the years. Some investigators and researchers questioned whether DeSalvo had committed every murder attributed to the Strangler. The reasons were not based solely on skepticism. They involved differences between cases. Differences in victim profiles. Differences in circumstances. Differences in crime scene details. And the absence of direct forensic evidence tying DeSalvo to every killing. That absence became increasingly important as forensic science advanced. In the 1960s, the absence of DNA was simply a limitation. By the 21st century, the same absence became a question. If DeSalvo was responsible, where was the evidence? If biological material existed, could it still be recovered? Could old evidence be tested? Could modern technology distinguish between the killer and contamination? Could genetic genealogy or advanced profiling identify someone else? These were no longer theoretical questions. They were becoming the new language of cold case investigation. Mary Sullivan's case demonstrated what could happen when old evidence survived long enough. It became a warning to anyone who believed a 50-year-old murder was beyond the reach of science. The killer might be dead. The witnesses might be dead. But the evidence could still be alive. That idea transformed the meaning of a cold case. A cold case is not necessarily a case without evidence. Sometimes it is a case with evidence that has not yet become useful. That was Mary Sullivan's legacy. The investigators of 1964 could not see the genetic information hidden inside the biological material they collected. The investigators of 2013 could. The difference was not the crime. The difference was the technology. And technology had changed the rules. Suddenly, investigators could examine the past with tools that had not existed when the murder occurred. That is why the Sullivan breakthrough carried such emotional weight. It was not simply about Albert DeSalvo. It was about time. For nearly 50 years, time had seemed to work against the case. Every passing year made it harder. But then time became an ally. The evidence had survived long enough for science to catch up. The same years that had taken witnesses away had also given investigators better technology. The same decades that had buried the case had produced better forensic methods. That is the paradox of a cold case. Time can destroy evidence. But time can also create the technology needed to understand it. And Mary Sullivan's murder demonstrated both sides of that reality. Still, the question of the other victims remained. If DeSalvo killed Mary, did he kill the others? Some people wanted the DNA result to settle everything. Could not. The laboratory could not test a theory. Could test biological material. That is a fundamental difference. Science does not ask who the public thinks the killer was. It asks whether the evidence supports a particular conclusion. For Sullivan, the evidence supported a connection to DeSalvo. For the broader series, investigators needed more. They needed crime scene evidence. They needed DNA. They needed fingerprints. They needed credible witness testimony. They needed timelines. They needed independent corroboration. Without that, the larger theory remained vulnerable. And perhaps the most disturbing possibility was that the Boston Strangler label had concealed multiple offenders. Imagine what that would mean. The city had not been hunted by one predator. It had been facing more than one. Different men could have committed different murders. Some cases could have been related. Others could have been unrelated. The Strangler might have been a media construction built from a series of frightening events. That possibility would mean that solving Mary Sullivan's murder was only one step. Other families could still be waiting for the names of the people who killed their loved ones. That is the tragedy hidden beneath the famous title. When a serial killer narrative forms, it can overshadow individual investigations. A victim becomes part of a series. A murder becomes part of a pattern. The killer becomes the story. And the victim becomes secondary. But Mary's life existed before the label. She had worked at Filene's. She had friends. She had family. She had a home. She had dreams. She was 19. Her story should never have required the words Boston Strangler to become important. Yet that is how history remembered her. And for decades, her family had to live with the uncertainty surrounding the man responsible. The DNA result could not erase the tragedy. But it could answer one question that had remained painfully unresolved. Was DeSalvo connected to her murder? Yes. That answer mattered. It mattered because her death had been used as evidence in a larger historical argument for nearly half a century. Now the evidence could stand on its own. The genetic connection did not need a newspaper headline. It did not need a dramatic confession. It did not need a theory. It was evidence. And evidence has a strange relationship with time. It becomes more valuable when everything else disappears. When witnesses are gone, physical evidence can remain. When memories fade, DNA can remain. When suspects die, genetic profiles can remain. When the public forgets, laboratory records can remain. That is why investigators preserve evidence. Because they do not know what tomorrow's technology will make possible. In 1964, nobody could look at a biological stain and see what modern DNA analysis could reveal. In 2013, investigators could. That difference was enough to reopen the story. But the story did not end with DeSalvo. It became a question of scope. How much did the DNA actually prove? How much remained dependent on the confession? How much remained theory? And how much of the Boston Strangler mythology had been built by fear, newspapers, and the desperate human need to make chaos understandable? Those questions are uncomfortable because they challenge the most famous version of the case. The public likes a clean ending. Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. He was caught. He confessed. He died. DNA later proved it. End of story. But real investigations rarely end that neatly. The DNA evidence was a breakthrough. It was not a time machine. It could not take investigators back into the apartment on January 4, 1964. Could not show every movement. Could not reveal every word. Could not explain motive. It could not identify every person who may have been involved. It could not answer whether the Boston Strangler was one man or more than one. What it could do was something much more important. It could establish a connection that had previously existed largely in the shadow of uncertainty. For Mary Sullivan, that connection was powerful. And for investigators, it became a reminder that even the most famous cold case must ultimately return to evidence. Not mythology. Not reputation. Not headlines. Evidence. That principle would guide the next stage of the investigation. The old files had to be reconsidered. The old assumptions had to be challenged. The victims had to be separated from the legend. And every piece of evidence had to be examined with the same question. What does this actually prove? Not what might it prove. Not what would make the best headline. Not what would produce the most satisfying ending. What does it prove? For Mary Sullivan, the answer was beginning to take shape. But for the other victims, the answer was still buried. And perhaps somewhere inside those old files was another piece of evidence waiting for the same transformation. A fingerprint. A biological sample. A forgotten photograph. A witness statement. A laboratory note. Something overlooked. Something preserved. Something that could survive long enough to become meaningful. Because that was the lesson Mary Sullivan's murder had taught investigators. A cold case can sleep for decades, but it is never safe to assume it is dead. And as the Boston Strangler investigation entered the modern forensic era, the most frightening possibility was no longer that the killer had disappeared. The most frightening possibility was that the killer might have left behind evidence that nobody had yet learned how to read. For Mary Sullivan, that evidence had finally spoken. But Boston still had other questions. And the answers to those questions were waiting somewhere in the shadows of the same city that had once lived in fear. The name Boston Strangler had promised one killer. The evidence demanded something more complicated. It demanded the truth. The truth became harder to define the moment investigators separated Mary Sullivan's murder from the legend surrounding it. For nearly half a century, the words Boston Strangler had created the impression of one continuous nightmare. One predator moving through Boston and leaving 13 women dead. But the closer investigators looked, the less comfortable that picture became. The murders had similarities, but similarities were not fingerprints. The confession of Albert DeSalvo was compelling, but a confession was not a verdict. And now DNA had established a powerful connection to Mary Sullivan, but not automatically to every woman whose death had been placed under the same notorious name. The case had entered a new phase. The question was no longer simply, who was the Boston Strangler? The question was more dangerous. What exactly happened to each victim? That shift changed everything. Because every murder had its own room, its own door, its own timeline, its own evidence, and its own final moments. Mary Sullivan's death had occurred at 44A Charles Street in Boston. She was 19 years old. She had been working at Filleen's department store. She shared the apartment with other young women. Nothing about her life suggested that she would become the final name in one of America's most notorious murder investigations. But the night she died, the ordinary world inside that apartment collapsed. Investigators found her in bed. She had been strangled. The method was horrifyingly intimate. The killer had not needed a gunshot from across a room. He had needed proximity. He had needed access. He had needed time. And after the attack, he left behind evidence. At the time, investigators could not know how important that evidence would become. They were working in an era before modern DNA profiling. The biological traces recovered from the scene could be preserved, but their full identity potential remained invisible. This is one of the most extraordinary elements of the case. The evidence did not suddenly appear in 2013. It had existed since 1964. What changed was the ability to interpret it. For decades, the evidence remained frozen in the language of an older investigation. Then modern forensic science gave it a new vocabulary. DNA. A genetic profile. A comparison. A match. The result connected Albert DeSalvo to biological evidence from Sullivan's murder. But now investigators had to confront a question that could not be answered by a single laboratory test. What did the match actually mean? The answer was powerful but precise. It placed DeSalvo's genetic material in association with evidence from Mary Sullivan's crime scene. That was a major breakthrough. But it did not automatically reconstruct the entire murder. It did not provide a complete timeline. It did not explain how DeSalvo entered the apartment. It did not tell investigators what he said to Mary. It did not reveal whether she knew him. It did not provide a motive. And it did not establish what happened in the moments between the beginning of the attack and the moment Mary stopped breathing. That is the frustrating reality of forensic evidence. It can be extraordinarily precise. Yet it can still leave enormous gaps. A DNA profile can identify a person. It cannot necessarily tell the story. Investigators must build the story from multiple pieces. Physical evidence, witness statements, medical findings, behavior, opportunity, motive, timeline, and sometimes confession. In Sullivan's case, those pieces had existed for decades, but they had never fit together perfectly. The confession was controversial. The suspect was dead. The investigation had aged. And the public had already decided what the story was. That made the task harder. Investigators had to work against the weight of history. The Boston Strangler had become an American criminal archetype. The name was larger than the case. The phrase appeared in newspapers. It appeared in books. It appeared in television documentaries. It became part of the language of crime. And once a murder becomes famous, the facts can become trapped inside the legend. That was the danger. The more famous DeSalvo became, the more difficult it became to examine his role, without the assumption that he was responsible for everything. But the investigators who revisited Sullivan's case had to resist that assumption. The DNA evidence did not ask them to believe. It asked them to compare. That is why the scientific breakthrough mattered. Science gave investigators something the old case had lacked. A way to test one of the central claims. DeSalvo had said he was responsible. The evidence now provided a biological connection. For Mary Sullivan, the old confession and the modern science pointed in the same direction. But that still left a broader historical problem. The Boston Strangler series had been built before DNA existed. The investigators who connected the murders had relied on patterns. And patterns can be deceptive. Suppose two murders share a method. That does not necessarily mean the same person committed them. Suppose both victims were attacked in their homes. Again, not proof. Suppose both victims were strangled. Still not proof. Suppose the public believes the same killer is responsible. That is certainly not proof. The more cases become connected, the stronger the narrative becomes. And once the narrative becomes strong, investigators can begin seeing every new detail through it. This is why cold case review is so important. A new generation of investigators can look at old evidence without the same assumptions that shaped the original investigation. They can ask questions that may have been impossible to ask decades earlier. Was the killer actually one person? Could there have been multiple offenders? Were all of the murders truly connected? Were some victims incorrectly included? Was DeSalvo responsible for some but not all? And if so, which ones? Those questions had consequences. They affected not only historical understanding, but the families of victims whose murders remained uncertain. For them, the difference between one killer and several killers was not academic. It meant the difference between having a name and having no name. Between knowing and wondering. Between a family story with an ending and one that remained unfinished. That is why Mary Sullivan's DNA breakthrough had a strange double effect. It provided an answer. And it created new uncertainty. The answer was that DeSalvo was connected to the biological evidence. The uncertainty was about the boundaries of that connection. Where did DeSalvo's responsibility begin? Where did it end? Could investigators extend the same conclusion to other victims? The evidence did not allow them to assume that. Each case required its own proof. That principle is simple. But in a case this famous, it is difficult. The public wants one monster. Investigators need individual facts. The public remembers the name. Investigators must remember the victims. The public wants the mystery solved. Investigators must determine what can actually be proven. That tension followed the Boston Strangler case for decades. And perhaps nowhere was it more visible than in the life of Albert DeSalvo. His story had become inseparable from the murders. Yet even his own confession had complications. He had not been convicted of those killings. He had no opportunity to defend himself in a murder trial. And after his death, the questions surrounding his confession could never be resolved through direct examination. That left investigators with an unusual situation. They had a man who had confessed. They had evidence connecting him to Mary Sullivan. But they also had an entire series of murders for which the evidence was far less direct. The result was a hierarchy of certainty. Some conclusions were stronger than others. That distinction often disappears in popular retellings. But it matters enormously. A cold case is not solved because one theory sounds convincing. It is solved when evidence survives scrutiny. That is what made the Sullivan DNA result so significant. It moved the case from narrative toward evidence. For decades, DeSalvo had been connected to Mary Sullivan through his own words. Now there was an independent forensic connection. That was a dramatic change. But the broader investigation remained open to interpretation. And this is where the story becomes more disturbing. Because if the Boston Strangler was not entirely one man, then the murders could represent something even more chaotic. Imagine Boston in the early 1960s. Women were being murdered. Fear was spreading. Police were under pressure. Newspapers were searching for a pattern. Then one suspect claimed responsibility. The city finally had a name. A name meant certainty. Or at least the appearance of certainty. But what if the name was only part of the answer? What if DeSalvo had killed Mary Sullivan but not the others? What if another offender had committed some of the earlier murders? What if separate crimes had been combined because the similarities were too frightening to ignore? The possibility was not impossible. And the absence of definitive DNA evidence from every crime scene meant the larger question could not simply be closed. This is why the Boston Strangler investigation remains so important to forensic history. It demonstrates the danger of turning a collection of crimes into a single story before the evidence is complete. It also demonstrates the power of preserving evidence long enough for future science to catch up. Those two lessons exist side by side. One warns against premature certainty. The other warns against premature closure. Investigators in 1964 could not know what DNA technology would become. But they knew evidence mattered. So they collected it. That decision would prove invaluable decades later. Mary Sullivan's case became a demonstration of forensic persistence. The evidence waited through decades of uncertainty. And when modern investigators returned to it, they found a connection that could not have been established in the original investigation. That is the power of time in a cold case. Time can be cruel. But time can also change the meaning of evidence. A fingerprint that once could not be matched may become identifiable through an improved database. A photograph may reveal a detail invisible to the human eye. A digital enhancement may uncover information hidden in an old image. A biological trace may yield a genetic profile. The crime does not change. The evidence does not change. The science changes. That is why old evidence should never be underestimated. And that is why the Sullivan case continued to matter long after the original detectives were gone. The investigators of the 1960s had been searching for a killer. The investigators of the 21st century were searching for proof. Those are not always the same thing. The first generation had a city demanding answers. The later generation had a forensic system capable of asking more precise questions. And the most important question was not simply whether DeSalvo had confessed. It was whether the physical evidence supported the connection. It did. That was the turning point. But the story did not become simple. It became sharper. The distinction between evidence and legend became impossible to ignore. The legend said DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. The evidence said DeSalvo was connected to Mary Sullivan's murder. Those statements sound similar. They are not identical. The first is a sweeping historical conclusion. The second is a forensic conclusion. One covers an entire series. The other concerns one victim. That difference is the space where the remaining mystery lives. And the remaining mystery has names. Women who were murdered before Mary. Women whose deaths became part of the same narrative. Women whose families had lived for decades with questions. If the DNA evidence could connect DeSalvo to Sullivan, perhaps other evidence could one day connect or separate him from the other cases. That became the logical next step. Re-examine. Retest. Compare. Separate. Do not assume. Do not force the evidence to fit the legend. And above all, do not forget the victims. Because the Boston Strangler story is often told as a story about a killer. But the evidence tells another story. It is a story about women whose lives were interrupted. It is a story about families who waited. It is a story about detectives who kept files. It is a story about scientists who learned how to read what earlier generations could not. And it is a story about one 19-year-old woman whose final hours became a forensic time capsule. Mary Sullivan did not know that her murder would become famous. She did not know that the man later associated with her death would confess. She did not know that he would die in prison. She did not know that nearly 50 years later, investigators would exhume his remains. She did not know that DNA would connect him to evidence from the night she died. But the evidence remained. And that evidence carried her story across generations. It survived when memories failed. It survived when the suspect died. It survived when the original investigation became history. And finally, it survived long enough to answer a question that had haunted Boston for decades. But as soon as that answer arrived, another question stood waiting. Was this the end of the Boston Strangler mystery? Or had investigators merely uncovered the first layer of a much deeper truth? Because if Mary Sullivan's murder could be separated from the mythology and examined through science, then the other cases had to face the same test. The names. The dates. The apartments. The evidence. The confessions. The inconsistencies. Everything had to be reconsidered. And somewhere inside those old cases was the possibility that the most famous serial killer mystery in Boston history had never been one story at all. It may have been several stories. Several killers. Several tragedies. Bound together by fear. Bound together by headlines. Bound together by a name. Boston Strangler. For nearly 50 years, that name seemed to provide the answer. Then DNA arrived. And instead of closing every door, it opened one. Behind it was Mary Sullivan. Behind Mary was Albert DeSalvo. And behind DeSalvo was a question that remained stubbornly alive. How much of the legend was true? The only way to find out was to go back to the beginning. Not to the headlines. Not to the confession. Not to the legend. To the victims. To the crime scenes. To the evidence. And to the moments when Boston first realized that something terrible was happening inside its own homes. That was where the real mystery had begun. And that was where investigators now had to return. The return to the beginning meant leaving Albert DeSalvo behind for a moment, and looking at the women whose deaths had created the Boston Strangler investigation in the first place. Before there was a name for the killer, there were bodies. Before there was a confession, there were crime scenes. Before newspapers began describing a predator moving through Boston, there were families receiving the phone call nobody ever wants to hear. The legend came later. The grief came first. That distinction is essential. Because the Boston Strangler was never born inside a courtroom. He was born inside fear. The first murders that eventually became connected to the investigation created a pattern that Boston could not ignore. Women were being found dead in private spaces. Some were discovered in apartments where there appeared to be no obvious signs of forced entry. Some had been strangled. Some showed evidence of sexual assault. The circumstances were disturbing enough to suggest that whoever was responsible understood how vulnerable people could become behind a locked door. And the city began asking the same question. Who was doing this? In those early years, nobody knew whether the crimes were connected. That uncertainty made the fear worse. If there was one killer, then investigators could search for one man. If there were several killers, the threat could be everywhere. The public wanted a pattern. Police wanted evidence. And newspapers wanted a name. Eventually the name came. But the women came first. One of the earliest cases involved 55-year-old Anna Sleezers, who was found murdered in her Boston apartment in June 1962. She had been strangled with a piece of clothing. Her death was shocking, but at first it was treated as an individual homicide. There was no certainty that her murder belonged to a larger series. Then came another. Then another. The deaths accumulated. The city began to change. Women became more cautious. Doors were checked repeatedly. Neighbors paid closer attention to unfamiliar faces. Ordinary sounds in apartment hallways became threatening. A knock at the door could produce fear. A stranger in the stairwell could become suspicious. The most frightening element was not simply that women were dying. It was that the killer seemed capable of reaching them where they believed they were safest. Inside their homes. That psychological effect was enormous. A city can respond to danger in the street by avoiding certain streets. But how do you avoid danger when it might enter your apartment? The fear moved indoors. And the investigation expanded. Police officers began comparing cases. Detectives searched for common characteristics. Medical examiners studied the injuries. Investigators looked for patterns in the way the bodies had been positioned. The similarities were difficult to ignore. But the differences remained. That tension would define the case for decades. Pattern was emerging. But nobody could yet prove whether the pattern belonged to one killer. Then, in 1963, the number of murders continued to rise. By the time Mary Sullivan was killed in January 1964, Boston had already spent months living under the shadow of the Strangler. The public was desperate for answers. The police were under pressure. The media had transformed the investigation into a national story. And somewhere inside that pressure, Albert DeSalvo would eventually become the man associated with the nightmare. But before his name became famous, investigators had to deal with something far more difficult. They had to understand the crime scenes. Crime scenes are silent. They do not explain themselves. A body does not say who entered the room. A door does not say who opened it. A piece of clothing does not say who touched it. A biological trace does not immediately reveal its source. In 1962 and 1963, investigators had limited forensic tools. They could collect fingerprints. They could photograph. They could preserve clothing. They could examine physical injuries. They could conduct autopsies. But DNA profiling did not exist. That meant some evidence could be preserved without being fully understood. The investigators were collecting pieces of a puzzle, without knowing what the completed picture would look like. That is one of the most important lessons of the case. They did not know which pieces would matter later. So they collected what they could. Years later, that decision would become critical. The Boston Strangler investigation was also complicated by the way the murders were discussed publicly. Once newspapers began connecting the cases, every new death became part of the same story. The phrase Boston Strangler created an expectation. If another woman was murdered, people immediately wondered whether the strangler had struck again. That assumption could influence public perception. It could influence investigators. Could influence witnesses. It could even influence how future evidence was interpreted. The label became a framework. And once a framework exists, people tend to fit new information inside it. This does not mean the murders were unrelated. Some may have been. Some may not. The problem is that the evidence must determine the connection. Not the headline. Not the nickname. Not the fear. The case became especially difficult because the killer appeared to understand vulnerability. There were no dramatic public attacks. There was no gunfire in crowded streets. The murders occurred behind closed doors. The victims were isolated. That meant there were often few witnesses. The killer did not need an audience. He needed privacy. And privacy destroys eyewitness evidence. A person can disappear from a crime scene before anyone realizes a crime has happened. By the time a body is discovered, the offender may already be miles away. There is no pursuit. No immediate description. No license plate. No desperate chase through the streets. Only a room. A body. And questions. This was the environment in which the Boston Strangler investigation developed. The police had to reconstruct events after the fact. They had to determine who had entered. Who had left. Who knew the victim. Who had a motive. Who had an opportunity. And who might have been watching. Those questions would later surround DeSalvo. But at the beginning, he was not the obvious answer. He was one criminal among many. The city had plenty of men capable of violence. The investigators had to narrow the field. Then came the emergence of the Green Man crimes. DeSalvo was associated with a series of assaults, in which he reportedly approached women under false pretenses and sexually assaulted them. His ability to manipulate victims and gain access to private spaces made him a person of interest in the broader Strangler investigation. But being capable of a crime is not the same as being responsible for it. That distinction would follow DeSalvo for the rest of his life. He had the criminal history. He had the behavior. He had the opportunity in some cases. And eventually he had the confession. But investigators still needed evidence. When DeSalvo confessed, the case entered a new stage. He described murders. He provided details. He claimed responsibility. The city heard the name it had been waiting for. Albert DeSalvo. The Boston Strangler. For many people, the mystery was over. But investigators knew the situation was more complicated. A confession can be persuasive. It can also be unreliable. A suspect may confess because of guilt. Because of fear. Because of psychological instability. Because of a desire for attention. Because of a bargain. Because of a desire to protect someone else. Or because the suspect genuinely wants to admit what he has done. Without independent evidence, investigators have to test the confession. Can the suspect provide information only the killer could know? Can physical evidence support the story? Does the timeline work? Does the medical evidence fit? Can witnesses confirm the circumstances? Does the confession remain consistent under questioning? These questions were particularly important in DeSalvo's case. Some of his statements appeared to contain knowledge that investigators considered significant. But there were also reasons for caution. He was never prosecuted for Mary Sullivan's murder. His confession existed outside the final judgment of a jury. And then he died. That meant the case could never receive the traditional legal examination that might have clarified the contradictions. The 1973 prison murder of DeSalvo froze the uncertainty. His death transformed him from suspect and confessor into historical figure. He could no longer change his story. He could no longer retract it. He could no longer explain it. He could no longer be tested against new evidence. And the Boston Strangler case became a mystery trapped in time. For the next 40 years the story would circulate. Some believed DeSalvo was guilty of all the murders. Others believed he had confessed to some but not others. Some believed he was not the strangler at all. And others believed the truth was somewhere in between. Then DNA changed the equation. But to understand why the breakthrough was so important, investigators had to understand what the original evidence actually represented. This was not a new sample collected from a living suspect. It was old biological evidence. Evidence associated with Mary Sullivan's murder. Evidence that had survived from the 1960s. The fact that it remained usable was remarkable. The science had advanced. The tools had improved. And suddenly, the smallest biological traces could become powerful evidence. When the genetic profile pointed toward DeSalvo, the old confession acquired something it had never possessed before. Independent scientific support. That did not automatically validate every statement he had ever made. But it made it much harder to dismiss the possibility that he had genuinely been involved in Mary's murder. For the first time, the story could be discussed in two languages. The language of confession and the language of DNA. Both pointed toward DeSalvo. But the larger investigation still demanded caution. Because the Boston Strangler was not simply Mary Sullivan. There were other women. Other crime scenes. Other families. Other mysteries. The question was no longer whether DeSalvo was connected to Sullivan. It was whether investigators could find comparable evidence connecting him to the others. That was a much higher standard. And the passage of time made it brutally difficult. Some evidence had been lost. Some biological material had degraded. Some records were incomplete. Some witnesses were gone. And some crime scenes had long since ceased to exist in their original form. Boston had changed. Buildings were renovated. Apartments changed hands. Neighborhoods evolved. The physical world of the murders disappeared piece by piece. But the files remained. Photographs remained. Reports remained. Evidence bags remained. And sometimes one small piece was enough. That was the lesson of Mary Sullivan. The evidence had waited. And now investigators had to ask whether other evidence might still be waiting too. This was not simply a hunt for the Boston Strangler. It was a hunt for certainty. Every case had to be stripped of assumptions. Every victim had to be examined independently. Every piece of evidence had to be reconsidered. The question was no longer what the city believed. It was what the evidence could prove. That is a much colder question. It has no room for legend. No room for fear. No room for headlines. Only facts. And the facts surrounding Mary Sullivan were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Albert DeSalvo had confessed. He had never been convicted of her murder. He had died in prison. And decades later, DNA connected him to biological evidence from the crime. That was the foundation. Everything else had to be built from there. For the families of other victims, the story was far from over. Their loved ones had died under the same terrifying shadow. Their names had been linked to the same killer. But if the killer was not responsible for every murder, then those families had been carrying a false certainty for decades. And false certainty can be almost as painful as uncertainty. Imagine believing you know who killed your loved one, only to discover that the evidence may not support that conclusion. Imagine living for decades with one name attached to the crime. Then learning that the famous confession might not explain everything. That possibility made the Boston Strangler case more than a historical puzzle. It made it a warning about how narratives can become stronger than evidence. The city wanted one killer. Perhaps the truth was more complicated. Perhaps the murders were committed by different people. Perhaps DeSalvo was responsible for several. Perhaps he was responsible for only one. Perhaps some of the cases were never connected at all. Every possibility carried a different ending. And investigators could not choose the ending. The evidence had to choose it. That is why the DNA breakthrough was so important. It did not solve the entire Boston Strangler mystery. It demonstrated the correct way to approach it. Start with the victim. Start with the evidence. Ask what can be proven. Then move outward. Mary Sullivan became the starting point. Her murder had a forensic connection. Now the challenge was to determine whether the same level of certainty existed elsewhere. Because if it did not, then the most famous serial killer narrative in Boston history might need to be rewritten. And rewriting history is never simple. People become attached to stories, especially stories involving monsters. But evidence does not care about attachment. It does not care about the books. It does not care about the movies. It does not care about the headlines. It only asks one question. What happened? For nearly 50 years, Boston had one answer. Albert DeSalvo. The DNA evidence gave that answer new strength in Mary Sullivan's case. But it also forced investigators to look at the rest of the story with fresh eyes. And once they did, the old certainty began to crack. The cracks were small at first. A difference here. Contradiction there. A detail that did not fit. A crime scene that felt different. A victim whose circumstances did not resemble the others. One detail alone could be dismissed. Several could become a pattern. And if that pattern was real, then the Boston Strangler investigation was facing its most unsettling possibility yet. The city may have been searching for one killer when it should have been searching for more than one. The name had promised simplicity. The evidence was demanding complexity. And the deeper investigators went, the more obvious it became that the real story was not about a legendary monster. It was about 13 women whose deaths had been forced into one narrative. Somewhere inside those cases was the truth. And the truth did not have to be simple. It only had to be real.